Every spring, the same scene plays out in gardens across the country. The peony buds swell tight and round as marbles, coated in a faint sticky sheen, and within days, they're covered in ants. Dozens of them, sometimes crawling over every bud, disappearing into the folds of the unopened petals, moving with the same restless energy you'd expect from an infestation. And every spring, thousands of gardeners reach for the hose, or worse, a spray bottle, convinced they're saving their prized flowers from an insect problem before it gets out of hand. Here's what almost none of them realize: those ants are not a threat to your peonies. In most cases, they never were. And the real relationship between ants and peony buds is stranger, older, and more precisely engineered than the myth most gardening advice has been repeating for decades. Today we're going to look closely at what's actually happening on the surface of a peony bud, correct a myth that's been passed down through gardening books for generations, and explain why reaching for that spray bottle might be solving a problem that was never really there. Before we get into what's actually happening, let's address the version of this story most people already know, because it's been repeated in gardening columns and family advice for so long that it's practically folklore at this point. The popular claim goes like this: peony buds are covered in a hard, waxy coating, and the buds are physically unable to open on their own. The ants, according to this version of the story, are essential. They eat away at the sticky coating, softening it just enough that the bud can finally unfurl into a bloom. No ants, the story goes, no flowers. It's a charming idea, the kind of tidy, symbiotic explanation that feels satisfying enough to repeat without questioning. It's also, according to horticultural researchers who have actually tested it directly, not true. Multiple controlled studies, including research conducted at university horticulture departments, have grown peonies specifically excluding ants entirely, using barriers, insecticidal treatments, and controlled greenhouse environments with no ant access whatsoever. In every case, the peonies bloomed anyway, on the same schedule, with no reduction in bloom quality or timing compared to plants left open to ants. Peony buds open due to internal cell growth and turgor pressure, the same basic mechanism responsible for the opening of the vast majority of flowering plants on Earth, a process that has absolutely nothing to do with an insect chewing through a coating on the outside. So if the ants aren't opening the flower, what exactly are they doing there in such consistent, reliable numbers, year after year, on nearly every peony bush in nearly every garden across the country? The real answer turns out to be more interesting than the myth it replaces. The sticky coating on a peony is real. That part of the folklore is accurate. What most people misunderstand is what that coating actually is, and why the plant produces it in the first place. Peony buds are covered in tiny structures called extrafloral nectaries, specialized glands that secrete a sugar-rich fluid, essentially plant nectar, from a location entirely separate from the flower itself. The name is literal. Extrafloral means, quite simply, outside the flower. Most people associate nectar exclusively with the inside of an open bloom, produced to attract pollinators like bees. Extrafloral nectaries are a completely different evolutionary strategy, and peonies are far from the only plant that uses them. Cotton, sunflowers, cherry trees, and numerous other species produce extrafloral nectar as well, though the peony bud is one of the most visually obvious examples most home gardeners will ever encounter. The sugar concentration in this nectar is significant, often containing a mix of sucrose, glucose, and fructose in proportions specifically suited to attracting and sustaining insects like ants, which have a strong preference for exactly this kind of energy-dense liquid food source. In evolutionary terms, the plant is not accidentally leaking sugar. It is manufacturing bait, deliberately and specifically, at exactly the stage of its life cycle when it needs it most. The vulnerable window between bud formation and full bloom, when the plant's most valuable reproductive tissue is still developing and has not yet had the chance to become a fully formed flower. This is where the actual relationship between ants and peonies becomes clear, and it's a strategy botanists refer to as a protective mutualism, one of the most well-documented forms of cooperation in the plant kingdom. An unopened peony bud is, from the plant's perspective, an extremely high-value, extremely vulnerable target. It contains the developing reproductive structures the plant has invested significant energy into producing over the preceding weeks, And at this stage, it has no thorns, no toxic compounds concentrated in the bud itself in most cultivated varieties, and no physical defenses beyond a relatively soft outer surface. To a wide range of herbivorous insects, particularly small, soft-bodied pests like aphids and certain caterpillar species, a developing peony bud represents an easy meal at exactly the moment the plant can least afford to lose it. By producing nectar at the bud's surface, the peony effectively recruits an army of bodyguards, and ants make exceptionally good bodyguards for exactly this purpose. Ants are aggressive, territorial, and remarkably persistent defenders of any reliable food source they've discovered. And once a colony identifies buds extraflorales as a dependable sugar source, workers will patrol that bud repeatedly throughout the day, investigating and often physically attacking any other insect that attempts to land on or approach it, whether that insect poses an actual threat to the plant or not. Researchers studying this exact relationship in peonies and similarly nectar-producing plants have documented measurably lower rates of herbivore damage, particularly from aphids and small caterpillars, on buds that ants were allowed to patrol freely, compared to buds where ants were experimentally excluded using sticky barriers around the stem. The ants are not doing this out of any conscious loyalty to the plant. They are simply defending a valuable, reliable food source the same way they would defend any other resource discovered by their colony, and in doing so, they're incidentally providing the plant with a level of protection it could not achieve on its own. It's worth looking at this relationship from the ant colony's perspective too, because the benefit runs both directions, and understanding the ant's motivation makes it clear why this behavior is so consistent, so predictable, and so easy to observe in nearly any garden with peonies. For a foraging ant, a peony bud in early spring represents an extraordinarily efficient food source. Unlike hunting for scattered insect prey or searching for occasional spills and crumbs, a nectar-producing bud offers a stationary, reliable, renewable supply of concentrated sugar, refreshed continuously by the plant itself for as long as the bud remains unopened. From a foraging efficiency standpoint, this is close to an ideal resource. No chasing required, no competition for a limited one-time find, just a fixed location that reliably produces energy day after day for roughly the 1 to 2 weeks it typically takes a peony bud to fully open. This is also why you'll often see the same general pattern repeat itself with remarkable consistency. A scout ant discovers a budding peony, returns to lay a pheromone exactly as we've discussed with kitchen foraging ants, and within a day or two, a steady stream of workers establishes a reliable route between the colony and the bush, visiting the same buds repeatedly throughout the growing window. Once the bud finally opens into a full bloom, the extrafloral nectaries typically become far less active since the plant no longer needs the same level of defensive investment once the flower has fully developed, and the ants, following the same chemical logic that governs all their foraging decisions, gradually shift their attention elsewhere as the reward diminishes. This is the part that matters most for anyone standing in their garden right now, spray bottle in hand. When you apply an insecticide, even a relatively mild one marketed as safe for garden use, to a peony bush specifically to eliminate the ants, you are not removing a pest. You are removing the plant's actively working defense system at precisely the developmental stage when the plant needs that defense the most. Without ant patrols, the same measurably more accessible to the actual pests that can genuinely damage a peony, which cluster on soft new growth and buds, feeding on plant sap and in heavy infestations, weakening the developing flower or spreading plant viruses in the process. Thrips, tiny slender insects capable of causing visible scarring and discoloration on petals as the bud opens, and certain caterpillar species that will readily feed on unprotected bud tissue given the opportunity. In several documented garden studies comparing ant-patrolled versus ant-excluded plants, aphid colonization rates were measurably higher on buds where ants had been removed, precisely the outcome you'd expect once you understand what the ants were actually doing there in the first place. There's a further irony worth noting here. Many broad-spectrum insecticides don't discriminate between the ants you're trying to eliminate and the pollinators, ladybugs, and other beneficial insects also active in your garden during the same spring window when peonies are budding. A gardener spraying to remove ants from a peony bush may simultaneously be reducing the population of ladybugs that would otherwise be hunting the very aphids the ants were previously keeping in check. compounding the problem rather than solving it, and often resulting in a bush that looks noticeably worse by the time it finally blooms than it would have if left entirely alone. To be clear and honest, as with the wasp nest and the attic bat, this isn't an argument that literally nothing happening on your peony bush ever warrants concern. There's a meaningful difference between the normal, beneficial ant activity described above and situations that genuinely deserve a closer look. If you notice unusually large numbers, combined, glossy residue extending around the buds themselves, dripping onto lower leaves and coating the surrounding soil, this can sometimes aid an aphid infestation that has already come established, since aphids produce their own sugary excretion, called honeydew, and ants will readily farm and protect aphid colonies for this honeydew in exactly the same way they defend the plant's own nectar production, an important nuance we touched on briefly when discussing garden ecology more broadly. In this specific scenario, the ants aren't just defending the plant from aphids, they may also be actively cultivating and protecting an aphid population that's grown large enough to genuinely stress the plant. The distinction is visual and fairly easy to check once you know what to look for. A healthy protective relationship typically shows ants moving individually across bud surfaces, investigating and patrolling, with the sticky coating limited mainly to the bud itself. A developing aphid problem typically shows visible clusters of small, pear-shaped, often green or black insects concentrated on stems just below the buds, with the ants moving in a more concentrated, repetitive pattern specifically around those aphid clusters, rather than across the general bud surface. If you find this second scenario, a targeted approach, a strong spray of water to physically dislodge the aphid cluster, or introducing natural aphid predators like ladybugs, addresses the actual problem far more effectively than a broad insecticide application that removes its own ant-based defense system in the process. If you're looking at ants on your peony buds right now and trying to decide what to do, here's a practical way to approach it. Step 1. Resist the urge to spray immediately. In the overwhelming majority of cases, what you're looking at is a beneficial, self-limiting relationship that will resolve on its own once the bud opens, typically within 1 to 2 weeks depending on your climate and the specific peony variety. Step 2. Look closely before assuming a problem exists. Check for the visual distinction described above, individual ants patrolling bud surfaces versus concentrated clusters of small, soft-bodied aphids with ants gathered densely around them specifically. Step 3. If you do find an aphid cluster, address it directly and specifically. A firm spray of plain water directed at the affected stems, repeated over a few consecutive days, is often sufficient to physically remove aphid colonies without any chemical intervention at all, and without disrupting the ants' beneficial activity on the rest of the plant. Step 4. Avoid broad-spectrum insecticides on budding peonies as a general rule. These products rarely distinguish between the ants providing protection, the aphids potentially causing harm, and the pollinators and beneficial predators like ladybugs that are also active in your garden during the same window, often creating a worse overall outcome than leaving the plant alone entirely. Step 5. Let the relationship run its natural course. Once your peony buds fully open into bloom, the extrafloral nectar production naturally decreases, and the ants will move on to other food sources on their own, without any intervention required from you at all. What's happening on the surface of a single peony bud is a small example of something much larger playing out across your entire garden, whether you notice it or not. Plants and insects negotiating through millions of years of evolutionary trial and error, mutual arrangements that require no awareness, no intention, and no conscious cooperation from either party, and yet consistently produce outcomes that benefit both. The peony didn't decide to produce nectar because it likes ants. The ants didn't decide to patrol the bud because they care whether the flower survives. Each species is simply following its own narrow self-interest, sugar for the ants, protection for the plant, and the result, layered together over evolutionary time, looks, from where you're standing with a spray bottle in your hand, remarkably like an act of dedicated bodyguard service. The next time you walk past your peony bed and see it covered in ants, you're not looking at a problem waiting to be solved. You're looking at one of the more elegant, quietly functioning partnerships happening anywhere in your garden. One that's been running on autopilot for longer than peonies have been cultivated in gardens at all, asking nothing from you except to be left alone for the 2 weeks it takes to finish the job. Have you ever sprayed something in your garden that you later realized was actually helping your plants? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and sometimes your stories become the subject of the next video. And if you've ever wondered what another small creature quietly living in your garden actually knows about your world, I think the next video might surprise you just as much as this one did. Until then, keep watching, keep wondering, and never stop paying attention to the small things.